Um, what I decided to do, folks, and I hope this is useful to everyone in the audience, and hopefully to kind of, future talks and so forth, is give a very broad overview of what I see to be an integral problematic in the conjugation between art and activism. I consider the conjugation of art and activism to not only be problematic, but to also be reductive. This problematic, I want to suggest, is acerbated when we speak about art and activism in the context of the Middle East. And I want to, again, perhaps offer some general points, I hope not too general, and I hope what they will do is perhaps give, hopefully, some critical purchase to some of the discussions you will be having over the next week or so. But I'm going to read, hopefully not too quickly, from something I've prepared so that I can keep my thoughts focused. And part of what I want to engage with today is something about raising questions, not about offering any definitive answers, and certainly not about offering a theory as such. And the question I want to ask is quite simple, but not simplistic, at least I hope not simplistic. Whose interests are being served when we conjugate art and activism in the context of the Middle East? And I think that question has very broad answers and perhaps is ultimately unanswerable. Is that Keith?
Yes, it is. I was just moving the microphone out of the way so there's not as much reverb. Sorry about that.
Okay. Can everybody hear me up until now?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. So, what I want to suggest is that the conjugation of art and activism in the context of the Middle East reveals a curatorial, academic, theoretical, institutional, and increasingly quasi-ethical demand that artists somehow do something. And again, I want to come back to this because I think it's quite problematic. We seem to be co-opting art into a discourse that it's quite often ill-equipped to work within. So before we go there, I want to offer to you what I consider to be the problematic of art and activism. And I'm going to sort of pull away from what I just said and offer a broad overview of the problematic of art and activism. And I'm going to start reading, hopefully for not too long, but maybe about 10-12 minutes tops. The forms assumed by civil protest and political activism today represent a complex shift in how protest and activism are currently deployed and understood within cultural and political debates. Individuals and communities are taking to the streets in unprecedented numbers, and activism, however we define this term, is a significant feature of the contemporary political landscape. But it also reveals other forms of activism, and I think these are interesting to note in the context of the way in which artists are imbricated within forms of political activism. And those other types of activism that this reveals are community and collective-based activities, individual voluntarism, direct action, non-violent protests, so-called hacktivism, lobbying and boycotting, propaganda, civil disobedience, and networks of non-engagement, and increasingly networks of passive non-participation. The question we need to ask is, how does art as a practice engage in this shifting and changing landscape of activism as a practice? It's at this point we land upon what I consider to be the first conundrum when we speak about art and activism. Activism, by definition, is an attempt to change the political landscape. However, you rarely come across artists who express such ambitions, even those who overtly deploy the processes and visual rhetoric associated with activism. I personally have yet to come across an interesting artist who has overtly said to me that their particular practice is involved in political change. They never make these claims, and I think that's quite interesting. So the ideal of activism, broadly speaking, suggests a proactive approach to social and political change. Nevertheless, art that adopts and adapts forms of activism tends to not be actively calling for such change. Rather, contemporary artists are more likely to explore the potential for alternative models of political engagement. And I think this is the crux. I think this notion of opening up the field of the political as a potential horizon of engagement is where art and activism can be productively used and utilized. However, I don't think this is always the case, and I think it's very rarely the case that art and activism opens up a field of political engagement. And perhaps I can come back to that later. I found a quote which I found very useful, and perhaps it goes to the heart of this definition that I'm trying to unfold here. And the quote is from Stephen Duncombe and Steve Lambert. I'm sure these guys are familiar to you. They are very much engaged with the nexus of art and activism. But the quote is as follows, and it's quite short. What artistic activist aims have in common is a fate that awareness can change the world without any specific follow-through. I'm just going to repeat that because it's relatively important. What artistic activist aims have in common is a fate that awareness can change the world without any specific follow-through. So, the intention behind activism proper to change the political landscape is often reinterpreted through art practices as a conscious raising exercise that has no specific follow-through, in fact, has no political ambition in and of itself. Nor indeed are those practices subject to the criteria by which activism is judged to be successful or not. And I think this is very important. There seems to be a case to be had that art as an activist practice, in its lack of a follow-through with political ambition, wants to have its cake and eat it at the same time. So the question that emerges here is the extent to which such practices, in the moment of adopting the visual rhetoric and processes of activism, neutralize critical analysis on the basis of their usefulness to those they purport to represent, and indeed their usefulness in raising issues around, for example, human rights. The danger here, to put it simply, is that these practices all can end up being merely exercises in theoreticizing the notion of activism. What you therefore often have in the conjugation of art and activism is a form of idealism, if not a sense of quixotic utopianism. Now, I'm not necessarily saying this is a bad thing. I think idealism has a place in our world order. However, activist art often tries to sidestep this kind of conundrum, this appeal to idealism, in its own sense of political efficacy. But in that sidestepping, it's quite interesting. In not being subjected to political criticism of art as activism, it often goes to institutions, the institution of art, to find validity for those practices. And you immediately start to see a bifurcation of the critical means that we have at our disposal to understand the ambition and indeed usefulness of art as a process of activism. We alight here upon a second issue, the manner in which art as a form of activism increasingly relies not on political judgment of its usefulness, but an institutional art-critical form of value judgment. The question then becomes one around the following issue. Do artists come activists merely engage in a bout of moral and political hand-wringing that sees their practices institutionally accepted without developing any practical or indeed political change in the lives and circumstances of those they co-opt into their practices? And again, I think this is a key issue. There is admittedly a degree of obviousness here to my argument. Activist art, which imbricates itself within forms of social justice and political struggle, often does so on the basis of subject matter only. Thereafter, this becomes a matter of audience participation and contemplation rather than action. And of course, action would be apparently the main goal of activism as a form itself. The This is about institutional acceptance and critical / theoretical validity. And both of those come with a further obligation. The sense that art, in the face of social and political injustice, does something, even if that something is merely alerting us to such injustice. And again, we come to another issue here. And this is the problem with the contemporary art world itself. The problem here is that the contemporary art world, which is itself both indicative of and a key component in a neoliberal world order, can only ever present these practices in terms of either appreciation or as forms of quasi-social work, or within the context of soft power artistic diplomacy. So the question, again to rephrase it, is this about what is acceptable to the art world in terms of practice, rather than anything to do with change, be it political, social, or otherwise? Okay, so this is just a very broad outline of what I see to be some of the issues around art and activism, the conjugation of art and activism, the fact that quite often these practices can only be fully understood or indeed validated within institutional contemporary art world contexts. The fact that artists as activists quite often set themselves up as merely outlining or drawing attention to issues, and therefore withdrawing that work from any critique of its political validity. Now, I want to take all of that and discuss the Middle East in particular, because I think when we do come to look at the Middle East in the context of art and activism, these issues become much more apparent and they become much more alive. In recent years across the Middle East, we have seen a trend towards political interpretations of cultural production, whereby art criticism seeks to re-establish a connection between art and the world, whatever you consider the world to be. The artist as activist has become a key trope in that discussion. In a period broadly defined as one in which we are apparently experiencing a global crisis, contemporary art in the region is increasingly viewed as a document or as a means for producing socio-political, if not historical, knowledge. And that knowledge can take many forms. It can be knowledge of revolution, knowledge of globalization, internecine conflict, environmental degradation, or indeed injustice. The link between art and the world, the artist as activist, be it causal, elusive, or interpretive, is established in that moment, for better or worse. And again, that's perhaps going to be part of what you are going to be discussing, I would think, in the rest of this panel, but indeed, perhaps going forward too. This is nothing new in itself, this demand that artists in the region do something or address historical or indeed socio-political issues. Many artists working within and beyond the region of North Africa and the Middle East have often had to wear their political identities and affiliations on their sleeve, so to speak, in a manner that would be both reductive and condescending if employed to a so-called Western artist. And I think what we're seeing here in this conjugation of art and activism in the context of the Middle East is a re-emergence of colonial or indeed imperial tropes for understanding cultural practice in the region. And again, I'll come back to that very briefly. If artists are going to respond to the immediacy of events, be they the recent so-called Arab Spring or the situation that we see across Palestine and Israel, and who is to say they should not react to these events, we nevertheless need to remain alert to a number of issues. Firstly, how the institutional rhetoric of conflict and the spectacle of revolution is deployed as a benchmark for discussing, if not determining, the critical legitimacy of these practices. Revolution, uprisings, internecine warfare, civil conflict, and human rights, all of these are points of references that have been deployed in an intensification of interest in the region, and the coextensive critical and institutional demand that culture either condemns or defends such events. The demand, in short, is that artists either become activists or archivists in this historical process. And I think this is tremendously problematic for any discussion of cultural production in the context of the Middle East. Within these terms, the artwork must be politically and ethically correct. It must reify the claims of a consensual, democratic, politically liberal, ethical, and secularist world view. And this consensual, democratic, politically liberal, ethical, and secular worldview is effectively the neoliberal ethos of our world order. Art criticism, in relation to North Africa and the Middle East, betrays an often ill-concealed contempt for those who refuse the logic of liberal secularism and neoliberalism. However, art criticism and art institutions often validate artists engaging in forms of activism that question, for example, extremism and sectarian forms of violence. And we must ask why that's the case. Why are these forms of validation emerging from institutions? We must equally ask who is being served by these forms of validation. And we must ultimately ask who benefits from the work of art. And I put the work of art into inverted commas. Again, this is an international rather than a provincial concern, inasmuch as there remains an ever-present interpretive danger that visual culture from the region is legitimized through media-friendly symbolisms of conflict. And this latter rubric is redolent of colonial ambitions to prescribe the culture of the Middle East to a set of problems that revolve around atavistic conflict, extremist ideology, sectarian violence, and religious indoctrination. So I want to just end this by noting the following. These concerns, voiced in the wake of uprisings and revolutions in the region, remind us that colonial paradigms are not only far from defunct, but easily resuscitated through an evolving neo-colonial preoccupation with topics such as the apparently irresolvable form of conflict brought about by an equally irredeemable strain of dogmatic extremism. And right at the nexus of that, you find a conjugation of art and activism, a very problematic conjugation. If art is indeed increasingly positioned as politically active, capable of potentially altering opinion and reconfiguring engagement with various communities and our sense of our place within them, then one question remains urgent. Is it now the case that art, by utilizing elements of activist practice, can not only affect social debate, but also offer unique ways of engaging with such debate? And I think this is the litmus test of artistic practices today. I mean, what are they doing? Are they legitimizing institutional concerns, or are they actively opening up alternative horizons of political engagement? Ethan, I think I'm going to leave it at that. I think I've said enough. And again, it was very much, I hope, something that was going to open up further questions. I'm very happy to take questions. I'm very happy to develop this further at a later date. And I hope that was useful.
That was incredibly useful. Thank you so much for joining us, Anthony.